Good afternoon. My name is Michael Watson, and I direct the Paul B. Henry Institute for the Study of Christianity and Politics here at Calvin University. And on behalf of the Henry Institute and the Office of the President, welcome. We're glad you're here. I want to say a special welcome to Karen Henry Stokes, who's joining us as well. Thank you for being with us. Karen's a great friend of the Institute, which is named after her husband, Paul Henry. The mission of the Henry Institute is to promote serious reflection on the interplay between Christianity and public life. The mission of Calvin University is to equip students to think deeply, to act justly, and to live wholeheartedly as Christ's agents of renewal in the world. And I'm glad to see so many students in the audience. My role this afternoon is very brief, but weighty, insofar as I have the privilege of introducing the person who will then introduce our speaker today. Wiebe Bor is Calvin's 12th president and the third Nigerian-born president of an American university. I think that's right.
It's now 7.
It's now 7.
In the last 6 months, yeah.
So Nigeria is stepping up, increasing its influence. If you have been at Calvin for a little while, you'll have noticed a welcome whirlwind of energy, vision, and enthusiasm this year, and Wiebe and his wife Joanna have come back to their alma mater and are making that happen. There have been a few different stops in between the Wiebe Bor, who graduated from Calvin in 1997, and the President Bor, who has come back to us in 2022 and now 2023. One of those stops was at a fairly well-regarded institute of higher education in New Haven, Connecticut. And there are some fun details about that, but I don't want to step on any of those stories. So at this point, I'll ask you to join me in welcoming President Bor.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I see, like a CRC church, everyone is sitting in the back. So welcome to today's lecture that's co-sponsored by the Henry Institute, and it's so lovely to see you here. I look forward to meeting you after the lecture. So I'm, as he said, I'm the president of Calvin, but more importantly for this particular occasion, and probably for my long-term career, is that I was Will Inboden's roommate at Yale. So I'm currently President Bor, but he may be president something someday soon as well. So we lived there together for 2 years while we were both at Yale doing our PhDs in the Yale History Department. And, ever since then, right then and since then, I've seen how he's such a leader. He's emerged as such a leader. And he's continued to impress me with his bright mind and the way that he understands and shares history, but also just the way that he leads in wherever he is. So we're grateful to have Professor Inboden today on campus with us to speak about Ronald Reagan and his national security team and how they developed a multifaceted and successful Cold War strategy to win a peaceful victory over Soviet communism, and how he believes Reagan's Christian faith significantly influenced that, which is why this is such an apt topic for this institute. So this book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, is the book that he'll be discussing today. He's also written, edited, and contributed to many books, journals, and other publications. And he was highly influential in the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998. That was significant at the time because it made U.S. foreign aid to a country based on whether the country had religious freedom or not. And so it was a significant piece of legislation that he drove through when he was very young. So he wasn't actually in Congress, but he was the one behind the scenes making it happen. And that actually delayed him coming to Yale by 1 year, if I recall. So from 2005 to 2007, after graduating from Yale, he was the Senior Director for Strategic Planning and Institutional Reform at the National Security Council under President George W. Bush, working in the areas of foreign policy, democracy, and governance. He then served as Vice President and head of the Legatum Institute from 2007 to 2010, based in both Dubai, where I visited you once, and also in England. And he led the think tank and the charity in its mission, including its research opportunities. And they developed something called the Legatum Prosperity Index, which to this day is still widely used as a way to measure how countries are doing in terms of prosperity and well-being. He is currently the William Powers Jr. Chair founder and executive director for the Clements Center for National Security at the University of Texas in Austin. He's the editor-in-chief for the Texas National Security Review and a distinguished scholar for the Robert S. Strauss Center for International Security and Law. Do you actually fit all of that on your business card? Yeah, okay. All right, good. So please join me in welcoming my friend, my brother, my scholar, teacher, and historian, Dr. William Nbode.
Well, thank you very much, President Bohr, and it is a great privilege to be able to address you as President Bohr for the first time in history in person. Many stories I could tell the audience here of our shall we say, adventurous graduate school days. I won't do that. I don't want to embarrass your president, but I will say next time you're visiting him privately in his office, ask him about the goat braai that we hosted to celebrate Nigerian Independence Day and a surprise visit from the Nigerian vice president, which they're still talking about in New Haven some 30 years later. So anyway, and we never did get that goat. I think it was Dr. Nwachaku got our allocated goat. So yes. See, did that not tempt you? You want to hear the full story, don't you? All right. On a couple more serious and personal notes, why it's a particular privilege to be co-hosted by the Henry Institute. When I graduated from college in 1994 and first moved to Washington, D.C. to be a much younger congressional staffer at the time, Congressman Henry, of course, had just died the year before, and it's a real honor to have you here with us. But even then, for a young Christian such as myself trying to navigate this thicket of faith and politics, he was known as the Lodestar, and he was spoken of with much affection and respect by many other Christian members of Congress and congressional staff. And so I feel like in that way I was following in a really noble part of his legacy. I was also a member of Capitol Hill Baptist Church, where your father-in-law was a member for many years, and had the great privilege of getting to know Carl F.H. Henry in his final years, and we had some really interesting theological discussions too. So anyway, so it's a great pleasure. And I was realizing as the wheel turns, the last time I was here at Calvin was some 22 years ago for a conference on faith and history in the late fall of 2001. It was just a couple months after the 9/11 attacks, and it was my first time traveling, being on a plane after 9/11 too. So it's kind of poignant to be able to gather with some fellow, at the time, much younger Christian scholars. So it's too bad that it took me another 20 or so years to come back, but thank you to President Bohr, thank you to Professor Watson that you have had me here. Turning now to the topic at hand, President Ronald Reagan and his Cold War policy, his legacy there. I've just published this book a few months ago, and I'm going to be giving you a summary of some of the themes of it. But before that, I want to tell you a little bit about how and why I wrote the book as sort of a reader's guide. And you won't find this in the book itself, but a reader's guide for it, but also some of my own reflections as a Christian and as a scholar. Three reasons I want to highlight. First, it's my effort to help understand what is a continuing puzzle. And I see that there are a range of ages represented in the room. I won't presume on anyone's particular age, but I see that some of you are here, I think it's safe to say, are old enough to have remembered the Cold War. Maybe I've lived through it, remember the Reagan presidency. And others of you were born much afterwards. And so I hope my remarks will speak to all of you in some different ways. But it is this, the peaceful end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the expansion of democracy and market economies in the late 1980s and early 1990s are remarkable episodes in geopolitics, and we still don't fully understand how and why they happened. Very few people expected it at the time. Reagan, I think, is rather singular in his vision that he did expect this, and that's one of the arguments of my book. But to actually understand how and why this amazing geopolitical event took place, it still is a puzzle. Plenty of good books books have been written about it. Plenty of other bad books have been written about it. Many more will continue to be written about it. That is one reason why I took up this book. And of course, the peaceful end of the Cold War is and the tensions leading up to that are the central theme. And I will come back to just how and why that is such a dramatic and unexpected thing. The second reason is to try to restore the role of leadership and human agency in international affairs. And again, if there's any international relations scholars in the room, political scientists, you'll know that the prevailing view among most scholars these days is that international affairs, geopolitics, the way the world turns is largely a product of structural forces. And I do not discount structural forces. There are, the rise and fall of economies and empires and nation states. There are shifts in the communications order and shifts in the balance of power. Those things do matter. They are a part of of human affairs. Of course, I, speaking as a Christian, especially in an audience of my fellow Calvinists here, I will say the ultimate structural force is the providential hand of God. And I make some references to that in the book. However, I also do believe, as a matter of history, as a matter of a personal conviction, that individual human beings, in some cases guided by God, can, I will put this provocatively, change the course of history, can move world events in one direction or another, or at least can steer them in some ways. And of late, there has been a growing view that the peaceful end of the Cold War and collapse of the Soviet Union was inevitable, that it was just a matter of that decrepit Soviet economy running its course after 7 or 8 decades and shifts in the international balance of power, and it was just going to happen anyway. And Reagan just happened to be the president when this was going on and had little to do with it. And then Gorbachev happened to be the Soviet leader at the time and maybe had a little bit more to do with it. My book is an effort to say no to that. And to disabuse us of that inevitability fallacy, to remind us that it's quite possible that the Cold War could have continued, that the Soviet Union could have continued, and even it is possible that the world could have been destroyed in a nuclear holocaust. We came much closer to that several times than is commonly appreciated. And so what I want to argue in this book is that a decisive leader, such as I think President Reagan was, with a very different vision for how the Cold War was going to be waged and managed, can in turn make a difference in how world affairs plays out. And so that's the second reason I want to restore the role of individual human leadership as an important factor in statecraft. And the third, and this is where I draw some on my time, I call myself now a recovering policymaker. I left Washington, D.C. some 15 years ago for the academy. But I did end up spending, about 10, 12 years working in the American government, the National Security Council, the State Department, Congress, as mentioned. And we can point, particularly in recent decades, to many failures in American foreign policy and many missteps. It's a difficult job that some of our leaders have done poorly. I even think about mistakes I made as a policymaker, lest this sound like too much professorial finger pointing. The third reason why I wrote this book is I want to explore a success story in American grand strategy, a success story in American policymaking that I hope will be of some interest to policymakers that are now wrestling with, say, the challenge of China, the challenge of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the challenge of the Iranian nuclear program. And not just a success story of interest to policymakers, but to American citizens, presumably most of you here in this room, who are concerned about America's role in the world today. I did not write the book with a concluding chapter on here as 10 lessons for policy today. I just wrote it as a pure history. I want that to stand on its own. But as I've commented in other circumstances, given that the United States is now facing the challenge of a nuclear-armed communist superpower on the Eurasian landmass, named the People's Republic of China, there's only one other time in our history that we have faced a nuclear-armed communist superpower on the Eurasian landmass, and that was the Soviet Union. And so the peaceful end of the Cold War doesn't have all the answers for our challenge from China today, but it has some insights that I think are worth looking at. So those are the reasons for why I wrote the book. Now a little bit about how I wrote it, and then the bulk of my time I want to focus on what I actually argue. For those reasons, the three that I laid out, I wrote the book as a narrative. This is my first time trying to write a narrative history. My previous historical scholarship had been more thematic, a little bit more academic, but I wanted to write this as a narrative which unfolds chronologically, partly to make it more interesting to ordinary readers. I did not only write this for my fellow scholars, my fellow historians, so that you can actually read it as a story unfolding, but also to highlight that contingency in history. Even though we now know how the story ends, and I'm not giving away the end of the book when I tell you the good guys win, the world, the Cold War ends peacefully, the Soviet Union collapses, we're not all destroyed in a nuclear war. President Reagan and his team didn't know that at the time. And to fully appreciate the challenges of policymaking, the challenges of statecraft, and no American president knows at the time how his, maybe eventually her presidency will end, right? But for our purposes here, we're focused on the Reagan one. They didn't know this at the time. And every day that Reagan woke up and walked those few steps from the White House residence into the West Wing and the Oval Office, he quite literally did not know if this would be his last day on planet Earth. And he also did know that some of the fate of the world depended on decisions he was going to be making that day. And that is a awesome and absolutely terrifying responsibility. And so as I try to recreate how the world looked to him and his team, and they were often a squabbling and fractious team, and the decisions they were making and the pressure they were trying to put on the Soviet Union and the outreach they were doing towards the Soviet Union. I'm trying to recapture for readers what that looked and felt like to them at the time, with that radical uncertainty of what the future held, and knowing that the stakes were almost impossibly high, quite literally the highest stakes that we can imagine. Another reason I write it as a narrative is, even though the American standoff with the Soviet Union and Reagan's combination of pressure and outreach to the Soviets is a central theme, it's not the only theme. And here's where I also draw in my time as a erstwhile policymaker. I try to show the interplay of events, the simultaneity of events. So scholars, we have the luxury of picking the one big issue we want to study and then spending 5-10 years studying and going deep on that one big issue. Presidents, particularly presidents of a superpower like the United States, don't have that luxury. They have an unrelenting cascade of dozens of issues and decisions pouring into their inbox every single day. Many of them quite momentous, quite literally life and death decisions. And they don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to ignore all those other decisions and only focus on the one or two big things that I want to focus on here. And so even though the book is primarily concerned with the Cold War, I spend considerable time on counterterrorism, on hostage crises, on multiple wars breaking out in the Middle East, on trade tensions with Japan and other key emerging economies in Asia, on U.S.-China, Taiwan tensions. The Ethiopian famine shows up, all sorts of different issues. You cannot understand what Reagan and his team were trying to do with the Cold War in the Soviet Union without understanding all the other issues crashing in on them at once, and how they tried to navigate that thicket. Some, I think they did quite well with, especially his Asia policy, I think is underappreciated for how transformative it is. Others not so good at all, especially Middle East policy and some of the counterterrorism. Okay, to the book itself. Let me set the scene, and I do this in the first couple of chapters of the book. This will be a walk down memory lane for some of you. It'll be a trip into the distant historical past for others of you who were born later. Set the scene for when Reagan is elected in November of 1980. What does the world look like at the time? The decade of the 1970s had just ended, and for those of you who didn't live through the 70s, it was a lousy decade. And I'm not just talking about disco, all right? So the 1970s was certainly the worst decade in at least a half century for the United States in geopolitical terms. Right? Let me just walk you through a number of the crises and challenges that our country faced at the time. Feels like we're facing some big challenges now, and we are. I think the late 70s was worse, and yet there are some parallels. So first, when Reagan takes the oath of office, being sworn in as president, is almost 8 years to the day after the last American combat troop had left Vietnam. The Vietnam War had been a catastrophe for our country. It was the first time in our 200-year history that we had lost a war, 59,000 Americans dead, deep polarizing divisions within the body politic. a very demoralized military, and out of that loss had been a very difficult decade for the entire military. Further budget cuts by Congress, a loss of belief in ourselves, and very much an eroding military edge in the standoff with the Soviet Union. By any measure, conventional forces, nuclear forces, throughout the 1970s, the Soviets had substantially advanced in the military balance. The United States was falling behind. So if you're keeping score in the Cold War scoreboard, we were losing. And it wasn't just in that standoff between the U.S. and Soviet Union. Communism globally was advancing. So just in the 8 years from our loss in Vietnam on up to Reagan being sworn in, the following countries all followed a communism, all in violent revolutions. None of this was by peaceful democratic elections. South Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Mozambique, Ethiopia, Angola, Nicaragua, Grenada, South Yemen, Afghanistan, actually invaded by the Soviet Union. On pretty much every continent, communism seemed to be advancing, and the notion of the free world, the non-communist world, was in retreat. Added to that, of course, it was, the Cold War standoff looked very bad for the United States. Other geopolitical setbacks were hurting us as well. Beginning with the OPEC oil embargo in 1973, America's energy supplies had been crippled. It produced, hours-long, miles-long lines at filling stations, and it symbolized America's weakness on the world stage. That these, Middle Eastern countries, which controlled our oil and gas supplies, could so humiliate and stymie the United States like that. 1979, the Iranian Revolution had brought the Islamic Republic to power, and in turn they had taken 52 American diplomats and spies hostage, held them for a year and a half. A further humiliation for the United States, made us look weak and crippled. And then, of course, the American economy was a mess. We'd had several decades of what's known as stagflation, high inflation, which we're dealing with now, but also very high unemployment. So even worse than our conditions now. And finally, so geopolitically, the United States looked in very bad shape. Militarily, we were in bad shape. It seemed the Soviets were winning. We are losing. Global communism is losing. Our economy seems broken. And it also seemed to many American people that the presidency itself was broken. The institution of the presidency could not work anymore. A general rule of thumb, overly simplistic way of thinking about how do we evaluate is a presidency successful or not is, can that president win re-election and serve out 2 full terms, right? When Reagan was elected in 1980, the previous 5 presidents had failed to complete 2 terms. The last 2-term president had been Dwight Eisenhower. That's an entire generation ago. Since then, Kennedy, killed by an assassin. LBJ foregoes re-election, driven from office over the humiliation and divisions of Vietnam. Richard Nixon, elected and then has to resign in disgrace over the Watergate scandal, which further erodes American trust in government. His appointed successor, Gerald Ford, formerly a member of Congress from this part of the state, loses re-election to Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter then loses re-election to Ronald Reagan. Democrats, Republicans, both, these are not a partisan comment, none of them had been able to complete 2 terms. And so for a lot of Americans, it seems like the president itself is broken, and you can't restore American morale and power and prestige and credibility on the world stage if the presidency itself is not working. And so there was a now declassified and available the KGB, the Soviet intelligence service, did a global assessment of the state of the world in 1981 when Reagan was elected. And the summary of it is, the world is going our way. So that's, the view looked really bad from Washington, from the United States, and looked really good from the Kremlin, right? So this is the challenge that Reagan inherits. Now, so what does he do about it? Here, a little bit of other Cold War history for you. The Cold War had started in the late 1940s, coming out of the end of World War II, this new standoff between the Soviet Union and the United States. Every previous American Cold War president, from Harry Truman on up through Jimmy Carter, Democrats, Republicans, they'd had a number of differences, but they all had, to oversimplify, essentially the same framework for the Cold War, which is that the Soviet Union is a permanent and stable part of the geopolitical order. It has been around for decades. It will be around for decades. Our challenge is to contain it. We cannot defeat it. It's not going away. We just don't want it to allow. We don't want to allow it to advance too much further. And even that, of course, was eroding in the 1970s. There was no notion whatsoever of actually the Soviet Union being defeated or collapsing. I'm sure that was maybe a hypothetical possibility. George Kennan had mused on it somewhat in the 1940s, but every American Cold War president had seen the Soviet Union as essentially a rival to be managed and contained. And they saw it as primarily a great power competition, a great power standoff. That's a term of art for two large countries with large economies and large militaries. Today, great powers would be the United States and China, maybe Russia on a good day, maybe Germany. Back then, the two main ones were the United States and Soviet Union. Now, every previous president had also seen that there are some ideological differences between our countries. So this is primarily a great power competition that happens to be a contest of ideas. Reagan reverses all of that. This is why he was very controversial at the time when he's elected. And, many Americans were worried that he was going to, be a reckless warmonger and had a delusional strategy. But as he put it during his campaign, my strategy in the Cold War is we win, they lose. All right, that's an effective, kind of gut punch on the campaign trail, right? However, if you take those 4 words seriously, we win, they lose, they contain within them a much more sophisticated strategic revolution. It believes that there is a possibility of the Soviet Union collapsing and losing the Cold War. It believes that there's a possibility of the United States and the free world actually prevailing in it, other than it just being a permanent standoff to be managed. And why does he have that? Because he has a very different theory of the case about the Cold War. He sees it as primarily a battle of ideas. Okay, so this is primarily a contest between two rival worldviews, between two rival political and economic and religious value systems that happens to be laid on top of a great power competition. So he reverses the previous equation of all of his predecessors. And so for him, Soviet communism is not a rival power to be contained and managed. It is a vile idea to be defeated. And again, so very different theory of the case. And from that follow all sorts of strategic implications. This was, of course, very controversial at the time. Again, most expert opinion thought that it was crazy to think that the Soviet Union might ever actually collapse or could be defeated. Most expert opinion thought that an American renewal, a regaining of the strategic advantage in this contest was possible. I can cite chapter and verse, and I do this in the books. Abundant particular citations on this. But this is both expert opinion outside the government. Scholars who had spent their lives studying the Soviet Union, but also within Reagan's own government. I cite a number of CIA assessments, essentially saying, Mr. President, the Soviet economy is stable and durable. It may not be the most efficient dynamic in the world, but it's going to keep humming along. One of them puts it very vividly. Our grandfathers faced off against the Soviet Union. We are facing off against the Soviet Union, and our grandchildren will face off against the Soviet Union, meaning it's just always going to be there, and we just need to manage it. So that was the expert opinion that he swam against. Reagan's assessment of the Soviet Union was, and here's where we can now appreciate how somewhat novel it was. He saw the Soviet Union as this unique combination of strong and weak, all right? So he was very clear-eyed about the Soviets' military strength. As I just laid out for you, they had advanced quite a bit over the decade of the 1970s. They hit the apex of their military strength in the early 1980s. Just to give you some general sense for this, right now we're rightly concerned about Vladimir Putin and his nuclear threats. Putin controls about 1,800 nuclear warheads right now, and a few more in reserve, right? That's a lot. One nuclear warhead can really ruin your day, all right? So that's a lot, a tremendous destructive power. When Reagan took office, the Soviet Union had 40,000 nuclear warheads, all aimed at us, all right? So that's what I mean about the nuclear balance was absolutely terrifying and astronomically more than we are facing now. Not to downplay what we are facing now. So he saw the Soviet Union as very strong militarily, and that's why he did his military buildup, and we needed to deter them there. But he also saw the Soviet Union as very weak in other ways. He saw it as very weak and vulnerable economically. We now know that he was right, but again, very few experts saw this at the time. And he saw it as very weak and vulnerable ideologically and politically and religiously. as I'll share a little bit more detail on in a bit. He was a man of, I think, very devout and sincere Christian faith. Some idiosyncratic aspects of it too, but it's a very important part of understanding him. He was appalled at Soviet atheism, right? He thought there's just something fundamentally wrong and unnatural about an entire political and ideological system that mandates atheism, right? That takes out carnal faith, and that is so oppressive to any people of faith. And this is why Reagan was particularly attuned to the plight of persecuted Christians and Jews in the Soviet Union behind the Iron Curtain. But that also for him, knowing the tremendous resources that the Soviet Union perversely allocated to persecuting people of faith, to him he thought that is not a sign of a strong society. That's a sign of a weak one, right? Why are you so afraid of these innocent Jews who just want to emigrate to Israel? Why are you so afraid of these Siberian Pentecostals, to take one celebrated case, who just want to worship freely? And why do you keep trying to throw them back in the gulag? And so he was particularly attuned to the plight of Soviet dissidents, other dissidents behind the Iron Curtain, and that to him symbolized the weakness and fragility of this system, that it spent so many resources tormenting and restricting its own people, that in the case of East Berlin or East and West Berlin, that it would build a wall not to keep unwanted people out, but rather to imprison its own people inside, right? That is not a legitimate system. Just as some examples. So Reagan saw the Soviet Union as, we might say the analogy, we often talk about the Russian bear. He saw it as a cornered and wounded bear. Now, cornered and wounded bear, I don't recommend, trying this at home, can be very dangerous, right? You have to be very careful about this. And so that's why the nuclear standoff and the military balance in the Cold War was very worrisome to him. But that's where he also saw it as vulnerable. And so to walk you through some of the pillars of his strategy, the top line is this. He, from the outset of his presidency, pursued a dual-track strategy of pressuring the Soviet system, trying to pressure it to actually collapse. He wanted to bring it down, but also diplomatic outreach. He wanted to keep the Cold War cold. He was terrified and very concerned about the possibility of the Cold War turning hot and the entire world being destroyed in a series of nuclear mushroom clouds, or even it turning into a hot conventional war where Europe gets ravaged by conventional forces for the third time in the 20th century. He was born near the outbreak of World War I. He had come of age during World War II. He would often say, I've lived through 2 world wars in my lifetime. I don't want to live through, let alone preside over a third, right? And so this is why from the outset, he also engaged in very concerted and I think pretty sophisticated diplomatic outreach to the Soviet Union. And his goal, and this is my interpretation here, right? So he didn't use these particular words, but I think this is the best way of summarizing what his goal was he wanted to see the Soviet Union's negotiated surrender. He wanted to see it surrender and collapse, but he wanted to do that through negotiations rather than through a hot war like World War II had been, where you then have to pursue an unconditional surrender. And so this was his effort to deal with that wounded and cornered bear, was pressure and outreach. So the components of his pressure, the military modernization is fundamentally important. A number of you may remember this, right? Dramatic increase in the American defense budgets over Reagan's 8 years as presidency. But what's often not appreciated is Reagan wasn't just trying to outspend the Soviet Union. He wasn't just trying to outbuild them. He was trying to outsmart them. Okay, so he knew that quantitatively the Soviet military was larger than the American one would be, or we could necessarily afford, or was even smart, right? I mean, if there's any defense wonks here, talk to me afterwards, but I can walk you through any number of specific weapons platforms and systems. So the Soviets had the T-72 tank. Between them and their Warsaw Pact allies, they had about 80,000 T-72s. The United States had just created the M1 tank, about as good as the T-72, and we had about 5,000 of them, right? So they're outnumbering us, vastly on tanks. I could go through this on aircraft, on missiles, so on and so forth. Reagan, as the former governor of California for 2 terms, who had presided over the first great boom of Silicon Valley, he had great faith in American innovation, technological ingenuity, and he wanted to use America's technological edge to design the next generation of weapon systems, which would be qualitatively so much better than anything the Soviets had, that it would neutralize their quantitative edge. And again, during the Q&A, we can talk more specifically about what that looked like. But that's what I mean by it was a military modernization. It wasn't just throwing more money at the Pentagon. It was building better weapons to actually outsmart the Soviets rather than just outbuild them. And the goal there was, at least in part, to lure them into an arms race that they couldn't continue, that it was unsustainable. No matter how many more rubles they throw at building more tanks and more missiles, they can't keep up with the American qualitative edge. And as he often put it, the Soviets liked the arms race better when they were the only ones running it. He said, we're now going to be running it, and we're going to be running it with faster shoes, better conditioning, pick your analogy. Another key pillar to his strategy, allies. I know that allies have fallen into some disfavor in recent years in the American political context. Reagan, I think, is the American president in history most dedicated to allies. There's not been another president before since him who valued allies more. He saw them as a unique source of American strength. He was not a scholar of history, but as a amateur reader of history, he knew that never before in human history had there been a superpower like the United States, which had such a vast global web of voluntary allies who were had not joined mutual security pacts and treaty commitments with us at gunpoint or by coercion, like the ways of empires or like the Soviet Union did with its Warsaw Pact vassal states in Eastern Europe. Rather, these allies in Western Europe and in Asia in particular had voluntarily wanted to be a part of the coalition with the United States. And just as we were sworn to protect them, they were sworn to protect us. He saw allies as a tremendous asymmetric source of American strength. And he also knew that this terrified the Soviet Union, and this is why Soviet leaders spent so much time trying to split and divide the United States from our allies. And so Reagan sees them in theory as a source of strength, but he also makes tremendous investments personally in our allies. This is why he becomes such good friends with the British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, with Japanese Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone, with West German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, with Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, and even with Pope John Paul II, right? I know the Vatican is not a formal treaty ally in the same ways, but because Reagan saw the spiritual and ideological stakes in the Cold War, he wanted to ally with, the world's largest religious communion, the Roman Catholic Church, and a Pope who is particularly committed to waging an ideological fight against Soviet communism. And again, I can give you more details during the Q&A, but these were not just nostalgic summit meetings that Reagan would engage in with these allies. If you look at some of the most successful American intelligence operations during the 1980s, they're done jointly with allies. A couple of remarkable ones we do with the British and French. If you want to think about the contributions allies can make to defense spending, to carrying their own burden militarily, Reagan persuades Japan to triple its defense spending in 8 years. A remarkable, almost unprecedented increase for post-war Japan. Many other examples I could give you. Another part of Reagan's strategy is what I call telling the truth about Soviet communism, the rhetorical denunciations of it. And again, even those who don't know anything else about Reagan will often say, remember, right, isn't he the president who said evil empire? Isn't he the one who said tear down this wall? Yes, he is. But there's a lot more to those than just artful turns of phrase or jingoistic denunciations of Soviet communism. If you look at Reagan's speeches over his 8 years as president, and you read them in context, you will see I think, pretty sophisticated, sustained argument he is making about the illegitimacy of Marxism-Leninism, the illegitimacy of Soviet communism, and the virtues of a free society. And this is part of waging that battle of ideas. And he was doing it not just with the American people as his audience, he was doing it so that the general public and our allies, the Japanese citizens, West German citizens, British citizens, will know where the American president stands, will know the stakes in the Cold War, and he was especially doing it so that the peoples behind the Iron Curtain, the peoples of the Soviet Union would know that America was on their side. And again, it cannot bear repeating enough. Reagan saw Soviet communism as his enemy, not the Russian people, not the Soviet people. He saw them as victims of their own government. Many examples I could give you, but I'll just cite one here in a second. But when you look at So in 1981, he says that Soviet communism, that the West won't contain communism, it will transcend it as some bizarre chapter in human history whose last pages are even now being written. In 1982, he says that Marxism, Leninism will end up on the ash heap of history. And again, these are artful turns of phrase, but any of you who happen to be students of Marxist thought here will recognize he's turning Marxist ideology on its head, right? Marxism believes in the historical dialectic, the inevitable march of history towards the intellectual, triumph of the working class and then a classless society. So he is saying, no, you are wrong about the direction that history is going. Rather, history is pointing towards your demise. In 1983, he calls them the evil empire. Again, sounds like a cute phrase, alliteration there. Both starts with E. It caused a lot of tut-tutting and hand-wringing among the expert class in the United States. How dare he call them evil, right? The Kremlin was outraged that he called them that. Not that he called them evil, but that he called them an empire. Because again, Marxist ideology says that imperialism is what capitalism does, right? They're the imperialists. We're anti-imperialists, right? And so for Reagan to tell the truth about Soviet communism being imperialistic, was really hitting them in their most vulnerable ideological spot. But as I mentioned earlier, part of his audience for these speeches, for telling the truth about Soviet communism, were the peoples behind the Iron Curtain. And when he called the Soviet Union an evil empire, while it caused wailing and gnashing of teeth among many pundits and other critics in the West, when Natan Sharansky, probably the most famous Soviet dissident of the 1980s, was imprisoned in the Gulag for about 8 years, just for his peaceful criticism of the Soviet system and his desire as a devout Jew to emigrate to Israel. A few weeks after Reagan gave that speech, Sharansky heard about it in his prison cell. He was given a copy of Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, which denounced Reagan for calling them an evil empire. And Sharansky tells a very powerful story in his memoir, which I repeat in the book, that he was overjoyed when he learned this. He said, finally, an American president who will tell the truth about our system. And he then, using the crude form of Morse code that he and his fellow prisoners had adapted, he taps out a message on his cell wall to the neighboring prisoners, letting them know the American president has called our oppressors an evil empire. And Sharansky says, over the next hour, shouts of joy started erupting throughout the prison, among other prisoners, realizing finally we have a champion who's told the truth about us. Reagan partly did this because he wanted to embolden them, to let them know the United States is on their side, but partly as his pressure strategy on Soviet communism, he wanted to create internal pressure on it. He wanted to inspire people who are victims of that system to not just feel like victims, but feel like we have a voice too, and to pressure their own government to reform and to change its ways. Finally, very important to understand Reagan's strategy is his Christian faith. And this was mentioned at the beginning, and I want to give you a little bit more on this. Reagan, while president, was an indifferent churchgoer. He indulged the First Lady's astrology at times. These are not, the normal tenets of Christian orthodoxy and orthopractice. But over the course of the several years I spent researching this, I encountered just overwhelming evidence that those idiosyncrasies aside, this was a man of, like I said, very devout and sincere Christian faith. I'll just give you a few examples on this, and then I'll connect it to his Cold War strategy. First, as some of you may remember, in March of 1981, just 2 months into his presidency, he is almost assassinated by a deranged gunman, John Hinckley Jr. Reagan is walking out of a speech he had given at the Washington Hilton Hotel in Washington, D.C. Crazed gunman shoots him and the Secret Service several times. A couple of the bullets hit Reagan. He's rushed to George Washington Hospital. We now know that if one of the bullets had been just a millimeter more to the side, he would have certainly died. And as it was, he came very, very close to death. Reagan relates in his diary, and again, he wrote faithfully in his diary through his 8 years as president. It's now available and published. I used it a lot in the research. He said, a couple days later, he reflected in his diary. He said, as I was lying there in the operating table, losing consciousness, the emergency room surgeons swarming about me, he said, I started to pray that God would spare me, that I would survive this. But then he said, I stopped and realized, how can I pray that God will rescue me when I hold hatred in my heart towards that confused young man who shot me? And so he said, I realized I first needed to pray that God would forgive that man and that I could forgive him because, aren't we all lost sheep and we all need forgiveness? And so, again, this is not some cheap applause line for a speech to a Christian group on the campaign trail, right? These are the intensely personal reflections of a man on the precipice of death. And so other examples. A couple years later, his father-in-law, who he's very close to, but who is also happens to be an atheist, is near death. And Reagan goes to his ranch in California for a few days of vacation during August, and he takes the time to handwrite a 10-page letter to his father-in-law, laying out the gospel to him using C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity arguments for the lordship of Christ, Lord, liar, lunatic, which maybe for some of you, and imploring his father-in-law to repent and believe and trust in Christ before he dies. Again, we only came to know this a few years ago when that letter was found in the Reagan family letter collection. Many other examples I can give you, but like I said, I point these out because these intensely personal moments, what I think show his devotion. But it's also very important to understand his Cold War policy. Shortly after his assassination attempt, as he's now spending a few weeks in the hospital recovering, he writes another diary entry saying, how grateful he is to God for sparing him, and then says, and I think the reason God spared me is to, in turn, prevent the world from being destroyed in nuclear war and to end the Cold War, right? So he has a very clear sense of providence there. He also throughout his presidency, in private top secret National Security Council meetings and meetings with heads of state, will repeatedly talk about, I think the Soviet Union's biggest vulnerability is its atheism. And I just know that so many people there want to believe in God, want to be able to worship freely, and that God will not, and that will ultimately be what brings the system down. So again, like I said, this providential sense of destiny, this providential sense of Soviet communism's vulnerability, but also his own imperative to be an advocate for the Christians and Jews and other people of faith behind the Iron Curtain who are suffering. This all comes together. Notice I've gotten so far along in this talk, and I haven't mentioned the G word. I've said God, that's one G word. The other G word is Gorbachev, right? So a little bit on that, and this is why I want to bring the spiritual themes here and then wrap this up. I argue in the book that Reagan plays a decisive and determinative role in the peaceful end of the Cold War, and I put that out there. However, he could not have done it without Gorbachev. Reagan himself would have told you he couldn't have done it without Gorbachev. Gorbachev, in turn, would say he couldn't do it without Reagan. And this is where this is an absolutely fascinating relationship, again, rather unprecedented in the annals of diplomatic history, even of world history, to have these two leaders of rival superpowers, both of which are dedicated to each other's destruction, forge not just a diplomatic partnership, but a genuine friendship. And a little bit more to tell you about that. Reagan is elected in January of 1981. Gorbachev does not come to power till 4 years and 2 months later, in March of 1985. What we now know, again, from recently declassified documents, which I was privileged to be able to be one of the first scholars to look at in researching this book, is that from the outset, part of Reagan's strategy of pressuring the Soviet Union, I talked about this earlier, he wanted to pressure them to deter their military, to weaken their political system. He's also very explicit. Part of his strategy is to pressure the Soviet system to produce a reformist leader that he could negotiate with. And when he comes to power, Brezhnev is a Soviet leader. Reagan does some outreach to him, writes him a touching letter from his hospital bed. Brezhnev doesn't really reciprocate. Brezhnev was kind of an old line Soviet, been in power for about almost 20 years at that point, not really interested in reform or negotiation. Brezhnev dies. He's succeeded by Andropov. Andropov, again, not much of he's former head of the KGB, pretty brutal guy, not too interested in negotiating. He dies after about 12 months. He's succeeded by Konstantin Chernenko. Another whole, old line Soviet, a bit of a troglodyte. Reagan reaches out to him. He's not interested in negotiating. Chernenko then dies, and then the Politburo finally selects Gorbachev. And around this time, Reagan is asked by a reporter, Mr. President, why aren't you meeting with any of these Soviets? Why aren't you negotiating with them? Reagan says, well, I want to, but they keep dying on me. 3 Soviet leaders die in the space of 3 years, right? And in some ways, that exemplified the decrepitude, the sclerosis, the internal rot of this system, that the only people it could turn to were not just so elderly, but of such poor health and lack lack of dynamism and vigor. Like I said, it's almost symbolic of the system. But all along, Reagan is very clear. He wants to put pressure on the Soviet system, on the Politburo, to select a more reformist leader. And finally, they do pick Mikhail Gorbachev, who's a generation younger, who's more dynamic, who's more reform-minded. I titled that chapter in my book, Waiting for Gorbachev, because Reagan had actually been waiting for a Gorbachev to come along. Now, I want to be clear, this is not a monocausal argument. Reagan does not dictate to the Soviets, thou shalt select Gorbachev as your leader. Gorbachev's selection is largely a product of internal Soviet forces, cycles of reform, internal Politburo dynamics, but Reagan helped set the external environment that the Politburo was facing, and also because of his interest in diplomacy, in negotiations, in outreach to the Soviets, he was looking for and waiting for such a Soviet leader to come along, and so he embraces Gorbachev much sooner than most do. They then have a series of 4 iconic summits. Entire books can and have been written on each one of those individually. Geneva in 1985, Reykjavik in 1986, Washington, D.C. in 1987, and Moscow in 1988, and I will come back to that one in a second. And it's fascinating to read the transcripts of these summits. I've read every word of them, right? And every word that Reagan and Gorbachev would say to each other was being faithfully recorded by a note taker, both an American and Soviet one, and so you can read both accounts. They're usually pretty accurate. And you see over these 4 years, these two leaders really at loggerheads on some fundamental questions about human rights and religious freedom, about the nuclear balance, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Soviet occupation of Central and Eastern Europe. It is not all hugs and smiles and Ron and Mikhail. Right? These are very tense, difficult negotiations, and yet Reagan sets the tone with the first one when he appeals to Gorbachev. He says, "You and I together have the fate of the world in our hands," and he doesn't say that in a grandiose, maniacal way. He says that he's trying to impress on Gorbachev the awesome and terrifying responsibility they have, that they've got to get this right. And somehow, even though Gorbachev knows that Reagan is trying to bring his system down and collapse it, they are able to build trust, and they are able to negotiate dramatic reductions in nuclear arms, including the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which never before in history, then or since, abolishes an entire class of nuclear weapons. And over the course of it, they build a really genuine friendship, which becomes very, very, very touching to see. And you can almost feel it developing in reading the transcripts of their meetings a few decades later here. And yet, ultimately, they do have incommensurate goals. Reagan wants to collapse the Soviet system. Gorbachev wants to reform it to preserve it, right? And so even as they're building these bonds of friendship and trust and collaborating to reduce the risk of nuclear war, they both have a sense that ultimately their roads are going to divert. Their final summit meeting in Moscow in May of 1988. It's Reagan's first time setting foot inside the Soviet Union. The Cold War is beginning to thaw. They've already signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. They have certainly reduced tensions quite a bit between their countries. They built a genuine friendship. And Reagan goes there. He gives a remarkable speech at Moscow State University, the first time an American president is allowed inside the Soviet Union to give a public address that is uncensored, broadcast throughout the country. Reagan doesn't use it to denounce Soviet communism so much as he's trying to make a positive appeal for the virtues of a free society and trying to speak to the Soviet people as a friend, as one who genuinely wants a friendship between the countries, who wants a better life for them. He does plenty of negotiating sessions with Gorbachev. And then this is what the remarkable part is their last session together. They've got about an hour. And Reagan says, all right, Mikhail, and they very much are on a first-name basis at this point. It's Mikhail and Ron. He says, we've covered a lot of important issues, some of our agreements, some of our differences, but there's something I'm really worried about, and I want to speak as a friend to you. I'm just very grieved that you don't believe in God. And Reagan spends the next hour speaking very personally, trying to persuade Gorbachev to believe in God. Go read the transcript. This is remarkable. This has not happened before in modern human history, right? Gorbachev is somewhat taken aback by this. You feel his confusion reading the transcript. Reagan speaks, when I say he speaks personally, Reagan even says, Mikhail, Reagan speaking, my own son, Ron, is an atheist. Reagan had a prodigal son, Ron, who had, renounced belief in God, and that could cause some tension in the family. Reagan speaks very personally about his woundedness as a father, that his son doesn't believe in God, and says to Gorbachev, I don't want you to make the same mistake, right? I know you're struggling with the burdens of leadership. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here. I think your life would be so much better if you would develop a relationship with God, and it'd certainly be better for your country, right? This is what I mean about you cannot understand Reagan himself as a leader or his anti-Soviet policy without understanding his Christian faith. Because again, this is not the standard. I've sat through a lot of meetings of heads of state of other presidents and members of Congress. They don't usually talk this way, right? But again, there's no evidence that by the end of the meeting that Gorbachev is persuaded. He doesn't get down on his knees and pray together, right? But you can also tell that he knows that this is coming from a genuine place of friendship and regard by Reagan. And Gorbachev says, all right, well, I'll think about this. And there's a touching scene at the, and I close the book with this, and I will close my talk with this to bring all this together. When Reagan dies in June of 2004, his body lies in state in the casket in the Capitol Rotunda for a few days. I was there in Washington at the time. It was a very powerful week. People paying tribute to him, mourners lining up for miles, days on end. And in the midst of that, Gorbachev flies to Washington, makes a surprise visit, and comes into the rotunda. And this is what he says. Gorbachev goes up to Reagan's casket. The guards keep the other people away. Gorbachev bows his head over it. He kind of slowly caresses the casket. Has a moment of silence, and then Gorbachev gets up and he's walking out and he says to a reporter there. I gave Reagan a pat because he was an extraordinary political leader who decided at the right moment to be a peacemaker. And that is the title of the book, of course. So anyway, thank you very much. I'd be happy to take any questions.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions. It is Q&A, so a gentle reminder, it's not A and A. So I would ask that if you have a question, you do have a question. I also want to give the opportunity for at least the first question to come from a Calvin student. So Calvin students, if one of you has a question, we'll give you the first shot at a question, and then we'll open it up and I'll run around with the microphone. So any questions from a Calvin student? All right. And go ahead and say your name, and that's for everybody, and then go ahead and ask your question.
First off, thank you. My name is George Holmes. That was a very informative talk. My question is, are there any aspects of the Reagan administration's handling of the Cold War which you would highlight as running counter to Christian morality, or would you more so say maybe that the ends justify the means given the nature of the Soviet threat?
Excellent question. And again, you'll have to read the book to get the longer account, but I don't fully expect that. So let me give some highlights. Short answer is yes, but there is a theme pervading the book, a theme more of tragedy. All right, so I've given you some of the highlights and what I think are certainly the positive outcomes here, and I stand by all that, and that's the main thrust of it. But and here I will also invoke my past time as a policymaker. What I quickly learned in my own time as policy, and I try to bring some of this empathy or perspective to researching and writing this book, is rarely in the annals of statecraft is a senior leader presented with clear policy choices where it's like, okay, I have to make a policy decision, and there's a good choice I can make or there's a bad choice, and I'm just going to pick the good choice. Much more often it is like this. There's a policy decision to be made, and the options are presented to the president, the secretary of state, what is it, and you're given a bad choice, and you're given a terrible choice, and you're given an awful choice. And your job is to pick the bad choice. Because in our fallen world, there are always not just trade-offs, but downsides, risks, other consequences, and intended or not. And that was overwhelmingly the case during the Cold War. And so, the cardinal example, which I spend quite a bit of time on the book for the Reagan administration, is when your goal is to defeat Soviet communism, worldwide communism, and there are quite a few governments around the world which are brutal right-wing military dictatorships, but at least are anti-communist, do you support them or not? Most American presidents, just about every American president before Reagan had said, yes, you have to support them because the alternative is worse. And there is, interestingly, a rather vivid and evocative historical precedent for this, which I will cite because it's very formative for Reagan, and that's World War II, right? So, I think we could all say that, presumably we would all agree that in World War II, Nazi Germany is pretty evil, and the United States and Great Britain as the allies were more on the side of good. All right, if you really doubt that, see me afterwards, or see, see Professor Watson, President Board. However, in the cause of defeating Nazi Germany, the United States provided billions of dollars in economic aid and military aid and weapons to the other most evil government in human history at the time, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union. I think we were right to do that. But we also need to acknowledge that in doing so, we were supporting a truly ghastly regime responsible for the deaths of about 20 million of its own people, okay? Why did we do that? Because the more urgent, greater evil was Hitler and Nazi Germany. And World War II would not have been won by the Allies without Soviet blood and treasure. And so that does not justify everything that's ever done. But going forward, when you look at the Cold War, some of this comes down to your moral calculus on Soviet communism. I've made clear, but I'll just make it very explicit. I think Soviet communism, I think communism itself is evil. I think Reagan was right to call it that. Consider, not to be too gruesome, just consider the body count. Communist regimes accounted for the deaths of about 100 million innocent civilians over the 20th century. 100 million, right? I mean, it is a staggering number, and it's almost too awful to even contemplate. There's not a single record of a communist regime coming to power on any continent that ruled peacefully, that respected civil liberties, that didn't set up death camps, so on and so forth, right? And so when and this is not at all to apologize for or defend every choice the United States made during the Cold War, but I think I start with the framework that, at least in moral terms, the Cold War was on the same moral plane as the fight against Nazi Germany, okay? So with that, then you come back to, yes, but there are these brutal military dictatorships that are doing terrible things to their people. And sure, they may be anti-communist, but they're still doing some awful things. And do we really want to fully support and defend that? Argentina, Brazil, South Korea, Philippines, Taiwan, Chile. I could go on and on. You know the full record. And so when Reagan comes into office, I'm giving a longer answer than you asked, but this is an important one for some of the bigger themes here. He's faced with a choice. All right, do we pull our support for these regimes and potentially allow them to go communist, or in a radical Islamic direction, as had happened with Iran in 1979, as happened with Nicaragua when the Sandinistas threw out the Somoza regime? So the most recent examples he had was, well, if we're not supporting them, they can go in a much worse revolutionary direction. So he comes in and says, yes, we're going to support them, and because of that, the United States in some ways does have some blood on our hands for some of the atrocities that these governments engaged in. However, and this is a more controversial part of my book, but I think the record stands it out. Over time, by a couple years into office, Reagan decides, wait a minute, I don't want to be trapped only in this what he thinks is a false choice between supporting right-wing dictatorships or letting them become communist dictatorships. And so he and his State Department in particular start pressuring a number of these military dictatorships to reform and democratize. And they make clear to the number of these dictators, our alliance is not with you as a dictator, it's with your country. And your people want democracy. They want more voice in their government. And so what does this look like in practice? It means that in 1987, they tell Pinochet in Chile, you're out of there. You got to allow free and fair elections. We're not supporting you anymore. They tell Baby Doc Duvalier in Haiti, you're out of there. We're not supporting you anymore. They tell the Chun military dictatorship in South Korea, essentially, we're pulling our support. You're out of there. You need to allow free and fair elections. Marcos in the Philippines, same thing. Taiwan. And you see this incredible wave of peaceful democratic transitions in the late 1980s. Again, a lot of them driven largely by internal citizen activism, right? But this is, in some ways, the Reagan administration's effort to bring a little bit more moral consistency to the otherwise very difficult set of choices. So anyway, you asked. All right, great question.
You do need to say your name.
My name is Reagan. Thank you so much for coming today.
I like your name. Okay.
Thank you. You highlight kind of President Reagan's the power of his Christian diplomacy with the Soviet Union. What would you say is a Christian perspective of the kind of dying art of diplomacy and the rise of more of a military foreign policy? How can you speak to that?
Again, a very good question, and you're touching on a big theme in the book. And I will give a couple of answers to that. First is Reagan was very personally committed to diplomacy, right? This is why he so much wanted to meet with Soviet leaders. This is why he did so much to empower the State Department, especially under his Secretary of State, George Shultz, who I think is maybe our greatest Secretary of State of the last 100 years. And for Reagan, a lot of diplomacy begins with empathy, with really seeing the world through the eyes of your counterpart, right? So even though he detested Soviet communism, he spent a lot of time trying to look at and understand what's the world look like through the Soviet leaders' eyes. What are they afraid of? What might they respond to? What might be some good incentives for them? Similarly, with his diplomacy with some of these right-wing military leaders that he's trying to ease out of office, he would say, look, I understand you're worried about communism. I am too. I understand you want to hold on to power. He said, I kind of like being president too, but I'm going to leave after 8 years, and you need to set aside as well. However, here's where I will quibble somewhat with the way you framed your question. I mean this in a friendly way. You framed it in a pretty common way these days. I'm not being critical of you, of diplomacy and military force being opposites, antitheses of each other. Part of the key to Reagan's diplomacy, his aphorism for it was peace through strength. And he saw military force reinforcing and strengthening diplomacy. He was actually quite restrained and cautious about using force. In his 8 years as president, he only deploys ground troops in combat once, and that's in Grenada. It's over in a weekend, right? But the reason he wanted that military buildup wasn't just to deter the Soviet military, it was to strengthen its diplomacy, so that when he's sitting there across from Soviet leaders, especially Gorbachev, it wasn't just the words they're exchanging, the personal anecdotes, talking about faith, talking about the nuclear balance. Gorbachev would look across the table and not just see Reagan, he would see Reagan backed by a very powerful and potent military. And George Shultz, the Secretary of State, is also a very sophisticated thinker on this. And he's very clear about we need to integrate force and statecraft. We need to integrate power and diplomacy. Because oftentimes, the goal, of course, is to win without fighting, right? But you need to have that credible threat of being able and willing to fight to enable the diplomatic outcomes. And so that is, again, another takeaway that I hope our leaders today will appreciate the need to integrate those two.
Okay, we'll take a couple more. And students, if you do need to leave, you can go. You are absolved. But we've been going just about an hour. Let's see. I see a question here. All right.
Hi, my name is Lathan Vanderleest. Thank you for speaking here. How much do you think Reagan's perspective, particularly his Christian one, influenced the perspective of his successors, and do you think it still has a legacy in the current political apparatus today?
Yeah, a very good question. And just about I don't think we've had an American president who's been an avowed atheist yet, right? So in that sense, every president has had some sort of sense of faith, some of them perhaps more orthodox than others. Reagan is in some ways fairly unique in his. Although interestingly, the guy he beat and then succeeded, Jimmy Carter, also a man of very vocal and genuine piety. You will also find some examples of Carter sharing his faith with other foreign leaders, but usually it's with allied leaders, right? So that's the unique thing about Reagan is he's doing it with the adversary leader. So George H.W. Bush, certainly seemed to have some sort of faith, but probably didn't connect it as much with his statecraft. Clinton's a complicated story, but there's certainly some of that, Southern Baptist piety there with some other impious activities thrown in. This is a PG-13 audience, right? Look, the guy I worked for, George W. Bush 43, very devout Christian faith, and that was, he spoke openly about that. Everyone who worked for him knew it. Certainly, very much shapes his decision to do PEPFAR. We just had the 20th anniversary of that. That's the big HIV/AIDS relief program. Obama is very interesting. Again, what obviously, I would speak about his faith, his particular affinities for the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. Trump, I've never met. He's an interesting situation there. Not quite sure what there was, but it would talk about things some. And then Biden, there's kind of that old school social justice, New Deal Catholic sensibility too. So, yeah.
Hi, Kristen Dumais, History Department. Yeah. We're talking about Christianity a lot, but of course there are a lot of Christianities. And I came across an interesting assertion recently that to understand Reagan's faith, it's not mainline Christianity so much, it's not evangelical Christianity so much. It really is a Christianity infused with the philosophy of New Thought, with positive thinking. I was wondering if you had any reflections on that.
There's something to it, and that's why I just meant. And thanks for that. I mentioned earlier at the beginning is I think there's with those vignettes I shared that you start with I think a pretty clear sort of born again evangelical framework with him. Okay, but you also have. He probably wouldn't have used or known these words, consistent strains of premillennial dispensationalism, right? So he's very fascinated with the apocalypse, Armageddon. This is, by the way, why he's a nuclear abolitionist, why he's terrified of nuclear weapons, is he thinks that they're, prophesied in Revelation, it will mean the end of the world. When Israel attacks the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981, Reagan writes in his diary, is this Armageddon now, right? Okay, so there's some of that. You'll have some elements of Catholic mysticism, some of his affinities with Pope John Paul II there, and you'll have some elements of prosperity gospel. Again, I think that's getting a little closer to what you're asking about. He has a somewhat more optimistic view of human nature than certainly Christian orthodoxy and our belief in original sin and fallenness. However, going back to my earlier framework about understanding tragedy and sometimes there being no possible good outcomes there, he operates within that framework too, and certainly his willingness to invoke evil over and over again in denouncing Soviet communism shows that this is not someone who is blithe or disregarding the presence of evil. And then once he leaves office, he does become a regular churchgoer at Bel Air Presbyterian, PCUSA at the more conservative end of that. So make of that what you will. But as a shorthand, I'm still comfortable placing him within the broader pantheon of American evangelicalism, which, as you know very well from your own scholarship, is a complicated, multi-formed entity. So.
All right, maybe one more question. Okay.
Hi, I'm Aaron. I'm studying economics, and I wanted to ask a question about current events. Do you think that current U.S. policy is too focused on the idea of containment when that's something that you just taught us that Reagan sort of threw out?
Just to clarify, are you talking about towards China or towards Russia or containment in general?
Probably China, but both if you'd want.
Okay, sure. I think at this juncture that a containment framework is probably a good starting point with China. And again, without going to, bring me back for a whole talk on the last 40 years U.S.-China relations, right? No, I won't go into that. But the very quick summary is since the end of the Cold War, especially since Tiananmen Square, for about 3 decades, the United States pursued an engagement framework with China. The hope was that by engaging with them economically, by bringing them in the World Trade Organization, by encouraging them to participate in multilateral organizations, that the economic growth and reform would lead to political reform at home and more responsible behavior abroad. All right, so that was the framework from Bush 41, Clinton, Bush 43, Obama. Towards the end of the Obama administration, this is not a revolution that Trump engineers. It begins then became a bipartisan consensus that hasn't worked. Right, China has gotten richer. That part has worked, but they've also become more thuggish, more authoritarian, certainly not a responsible international actor, nor reforming at home. And it's now pretty clear that China's ambitions are to to upend a lot of the international order that the United States has helped to create and to underwrite, and to preserve the CCP's, Chinese Communist Party's monopoly and power at home, while frankly promoting authoritarianism abroad. They are not analogous to the Soviet Union in that they are not aggressively exporting Xi Jinping thought, right? But certainly when you see their efforts abroad, it's about trying to prop up or support authoritarian governments. So yes, I think a containment framework is much more warranted now. But I also, channeling my inner Reaganite, would like to see that coupled with real pressure on the CCP itself, particularly a lot more support for human rights and religious freedom internally. We need to be doing a lot more to highlight the Uyghur genocide, for example. We should have done more to support Hong Kong democracy. I can give you examples there. So containment is really only focused on external behavior, and I think we need to be doing more to support the Chinese people against the oppressions of their own government.
All right, would you join me in thanking Dr. Inbitten?
Thank you very much.